Welcome to this Killick Explains video, and welcome to a topical one just past the latest and important budget, first one from this government, and that is why the 10-year gilt yield will stay in the headlines and matters to savers and investors. So the background is obviously with the recent budget, the 10-year gilt yield's been in the news quite a lot. It's a vital plank of investing generally, actually, that number. So here's a reminder about what it is and why it's so important. So first of all, what is a yield? Right, well, a yield is just an annual percentage return, in this case on a government IOU. So the government issue these things in order to be able to borrow money, and investors buy them as a source both potentially of income and or a capital gain potentially. The point is that the income is normally fixed. In other words, there is a fixed amount of income that's paid. Therefore, the price will move around as these things are traded to give a total potential yield to maturity at the point the bond is bought. And that yield to maturity, as I mentioned, is made up of a fixed amount of income and a potential, hopefully, capital gain or loss arising between now and the point the bond matures or is redeemed. And what these government IOUs, because they're government backed, give you is a zero risk investment. And therefore the gilt yield, 10-year gilt yield, is seen as a kind of risk-free rate, and it kind of benchmarks other rates in the market. Now, why 10-year? I mean, you could pick any government IOU, they have different maturities. Well, it's seen as a medium term, all right, and therefore representative benchmark gilt, okay? And it creates, as I mentioned, something called the risk-free rate. So whatever that return is, that overall yield to maturity as a percentage, that's really important for what the market expects other returns to be on other assets. So basically, the recent budget is quite likely, it was doing it before, it'll probably carry on doing it afterwards, to, on balance, push that number upwards. Why? First of all, if a government borrows quite a bit of money, billions, in order to spend it, public services and so on, that's going to create rising inflation expectations. Now, recently, inflation has been coming down in general, but a big program of expenditure could push inflation back up again. All right. So there's one factor. And basically, if you're wondering how that works, well, inflation expectations will tend to push fixed income bond prices down and increase yields, right? There's a kind of seesaw effect there. Then there's supply and demand. Simply by issuing more of these IOUs into the market, borrowing more, potentially you push the price down and push the yield up based on that fixed income. And then there's a technical complicating factor, which is the role of what used to be called quantitative easing and is now called quantitative tightening, which is where the government is slowly reeling in, all right, the amount of liquidity that it previously offered to the market. I cover that in other videos, so I won't tell you too much about it here, but the principal factors influencing that 10-year gilt yield, inflation expectations, and supply and demand. Now, what do we got? What's the recent picture? Well, we've seen the government issuing more gilts in order to spend, as I just mentioned, okay? And therefore, we're going to have to watch the role of what are called the bond vigilantes. And that's a grandiose way of saying the gilts market needs to be comfortable, the bond market needs to be comfortable with the amount of borrowing that the government is doing and plans to do in the future. And where you see headlines around bond vigilantes, it's just saying that yields on bonds are being pushed up. The minimum return investors demand for buying them is being pushed up as nervousness increases or decreases around what the government's doing. Now, what about for savers and investors? Let's cut to the chase, because most of the people watching this are savers and or investors. Well, this 10-year gilt yield I've mentioned, this benchmark risk-free return on a government IOU influences quite a few different numbers across the market. It will influence the rate you can earn on savings. And if you're a saver and the 10-year gilt yield starts rising, you might see an increase in the amount you can earn on savings. But it will also potentially impact mortgage rates, so that's not such good news for borrowers. It also potentially impacts annuity rates. That's where people hand over a fixed sum of money around the time they dial down or stop work in return for an income stream from a life assurance company. That income stream is connected to what's happening to the 10-year gilt yield. And just to finish on a technical point, it'll affect equity discount rates. And that's a rather grandiose way of saying that if essentially people are demanding more of a return to lend their money to the government by buying gilts, they'll probably expect an even higher return for taking the risk of investing in something which is riskier, like shares, for example. So increasing gilt yields will tend to push up the required return from equities, and that may impact the price. So there you have it. It's an important number. It's quite a technical number, but I've just tried to give you a flavour for some things to keep an eye on as we go forward from here. For more information, if you're thinking, crikey, I don't know as much as I thought about this market, then there are lots of videos around bonds and fixed income securities, killick.com/resources. My How to Invest in Equities guide actually has a section that deals with bonds as well. So again, same section of the website. And of course, our quarterly flagship magazine, Confidant, will often contain an article on bonds.